Night had fallen hard over Red Ridge. Rain hammered the shingles of the old Harper house. Each dropped like a drumbeat in the tense silence. Jack Harper swung down from his horse, mud splattering his boots, and froze in the doorway. A woman stood there, drenched, yet unshaken. Her hand gripped a gun as if it weighed nothing. "You're too late, husband," she said, her voice slicing through the storm. "They're already coming for our land." Lightning illuminated her face for a fleeting second, sharp, determined, and terrifyingly calm. Just a month ago, Jack Harper had been a man without roots, drifting across the West like smoke carried by the wind. His days were spent driving cattle over endless plains, moving from one dusty town to another, never staying long enough to form bonds. He had learned, painfully, that attachment were luxuries for fools, luxuries that had killed. It had started with his younger brother, Tommy. They had grown up together in a modest cabin outside Red Ridge, the rolling hills and sparse forests shaping their childhood adventures. Tommy had been lively, fearless, always challenging Jack to races of fields or dares that ended in scraped knees and laughter. But the war had taken him, not in some noble charge or in defense of justice, but because their commander, a man Jack once called mentor, betrayed their unit. He had sent them into a trap, leaving Tommy and several others to die while he escaped unscathed. Jack never forgave. The loss hardened him. Grief and rage fused into a solitary determination to survive by his own wits alone. From that day, he trusted no one, not townsfolk, not fellow cowhands, not even those who called themselves friends. He became a ghost in the West, always moving, always watching, never letting anyone close enough to see the man behind the wary eyes. He had learned the land in a way most men never would. He could tell where a stream ran underground by the bends in the grass, sense a storm before it hit by the smell of ozone and the restlessness of animals. Horses responded to his quiet commands. Cattle followed his movements instinctively, and he had developed a kind of sixth sense for danger. It was a life he had chosen, hard, lonely, and free from human betrayal. And yet, somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of pain and armor, there lingered a flicker of something he had tried to extinguish, a longing for connection, a dream of a place where he could belong. He pushed it down ruthlessly, fearing that hope was the easiest way to break a man. He had earned a reputation along the way, known as a reliable cattle driver and a sharpshooter when necessary. He traveled with his gear slung over his back and a carefully measured smile for strangers. Townsfolk whispered stories about the man who arrived, did his work, and disappeared without leaving a trace. Some said he was lucky, others that he was cursed. The truth was simpler. Jack was cautious, disciplined, and utterly unwilling to be ensnared again. On a particularly cold morning, just a few weeks ago, he had been rounding up a herd near the jagged cliffs of Red Ridge when he saw signs of trouble. Footprints in the mud that didn't belong to his team, distant smoke curling from a horizon. He had followed them quietly, hidden by the sparse pines and scrub, until he discovered a band of outlaws harassing a family trying to defend their homestead. Jack didn't linger in sentimentality, yet something in him stirred. He had intervened, shooting precise warning shots and forcing the gang to retreat. That night, as he watched the family tend to their property, he felt a long-forgotten warmth, a small and dangerous reminder of what it meant to care. Still, he returned to his solitary wanderings. The West was unforgiving, and sentiment was a weakness he could not afford. Yet, every ride back through the open plain seemed to echo with a faint memory of Tommy's laughter, reminding him of the boy who had loved reckless adventures and had paid for it with his life. And now, standing in the doorway of the Harper house, Jack felt the past and present collide. The storm outside was nothing compared to the turmoil rising within him. He was no longer alone on the plains. A woman with a gun and a fierce claim on his attention had appeared, demanding something he had long forsaken: connection, responsibility, and courage. For the first time in months, Jack Harper's life had the potential to change, not because he sought it, but because it had arrived, relentless and unavoidable, like the thunder rolling over Red Ridge. He clenched his fists, feeling the old instinct to run gnawing at him, but the memory of the man who had betrayed Tommy and the lessons he had carved into himself told him something else. Running no longer guaranteed safety. Sometimes, standing, facing the storm, and risking everything was the only way to survive. Jack inhaled the damp, cold air, letting it fill his lungs, and try to silence the memories that clawed at him. His life on the plains had prepared him for isolation, danger, and hardship, but had not prepared him for the intensity of human desperation in another person's eyes. And in the shadows of that doorway, illuminated by flashes of lightning, he glimpsed it. The spark of someone else's fight, someone's life intertwined with his own. He didn't know yet if he could trust her. He didn't know if he could trust himself. But for the first time in a long time, Jack Harper felt something stir within him that he hadn't dared to acknowledge. A faint, dangerous, irresistible pull toward involvement, toward connection, toward a fight that was bigger than himself. And for a man who had wandered endlessly to avoid pain, that pull was terrifying. Emma Harper's boots sank into the muddy ground as the rain continued to lash the Harper house. She held the gun tightly, but it trembled slightly in her hand. Jack Harper's gaze never left her, taking in every movement, every shadow crossing her face. She looked young, fragile even, but her eyes burned with determination, a fire that had not been extinguished by months of fear or isolation. "Jack," she began, her voice quivering but carrying a strange authority, "the land is not just ours. It belongs to our families. According to the old contract, we are married." She swallowed, forcing her chin upward against the wind. "I know it sounds strange, but legally it's binding. The banker, his men, if they succeed, everything will be gone. The house, the barn, even the pasture where your father raised cattle. It will be ours no longer." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Married?" he muttered, voice rough from disuse and conversation. "I don't know any contract. I don't know you." Emma stepped closer, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "I don't expect you to know me, but I'm the one who's been protecting the house while you wandered the plains." Her voice hardened. "I've been doing it alone, and now they're coming." She gestured vaguely toward the dark horizon, where the occasional flash of torchlight betrayed the approach of men. "The banker has already sent them. He doesn't care about contracts or law. He wants the land, and I have nothing else. If I lose this house, I lose my family's legacy, my home, my future." Jack studied her. For weeks, he had avoided attachments, believing that trust was a dangerous illusion. But looking at her now, something in his old instinct stirred. She was scared, yes, but she was also brave. She wasn't pleading for pity. She was demanding action. "You're telling me a banker, a gang, and a contract, none of it matters to the law?" Jack asked quietly, glancing toward the distant flicker of torches. "And you wanted to fight them because we're married?" His words carried no humor, only the weight of disbelief. Emma's lips pressed together. "It's not a joke," she said. "I've tried everything else. Letters, petitions, pleading. The banker has money, influence. Even the sheriff is on his payroll. I have no one else. No one but you." Jack's hand brushed against the doorway frame, feeling the cold beneath his fingers. He remembered the plains, the endless horizon, the solitary rides. He had learned to rely on no one, to keep his heart locked away. But now, in the rain, faced with someone clinging to hope, he felt the old caution wrestle with something he had not felt in years, a flicker of obligation, of responsibility, of connection. "Why me?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost inaudible against the storm. "Why not someone who knows how to fight, who knows the land?" Emma took a deep breath. "Because you've been here before. The Harper name carries weight. The Harper family has history, skills, and knowledge. You know the land better than anyone. And I know you don't like to be tied down, but if we fail, it will be too late. There's no second chance. The banker, he's ruthless." Her words hit him differently than the sound of thunder or the wind against the house. She was desperate, yes, but she was also honest. There was no pretense, no manipulation, only the stark truth. Their family's land and everything it represented was under threat. Jack exhaled slowly. For a man who had spent months avoiding danger and avoiding people, the idea of stepping into this fight should have filled him with dread. But instead, he felt the familiar stir of his old instincts, the ones that had kept him alive on the plains, the ones that had made him a solitary force to be reckoned with. He noticed her hands shaking slightly, but only slightly, She was holding herself with remarkable strength despite the fear. He remembered Tommy, remembered how quickly life could be stolen away by betrayal or cowardice. And now, here was someone standing on the edge of disaster, hoping he would make the choice to act. Jack's eyes drifted toward the windows. Flashes of torchlight danced across the rain-streaked glass, shadows of movement against the horizon. The gang was close. They would reach the house soon, and once they did, there would be no turning back. Emma's gaze met his. "I need you," she said simply. "I can't do this alone." Jack stayed silent for a long moment, weighing his options. He could leave. He could turn his back, mount his horse, and disappear into night like he always had. That had been his way for months, even years, to avoid entanglements, to avoid loss. But the thought of that woman standing there, drenched, determined, holding the last defense of home she loved, it stirred something in him, something primal, something he could not ignore. For a fleeting instant, he saw a life that was different from his lonely wanderings, a life where courage wasn't just survival, but protection, a life where the risk of connection might be worth the cost. Jack's hand twitched toward his belt, instinctively brushing the handle of his revolver. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. His boots squelched in the mud, and the night seemed to close in around them. And yet, despite the storm, despite the approaching threat, Jack Harper felt the old nomadic caution collide with new purpose, a spark of something he had thought dead. The willingness to stand and fight, not for himself, but for someone else. He looked at Emma again. Her lips were pressed tight, her knuckles white against the gun, her eyes unwavering. In that moment, he understood the stakes. They weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for hope, for legacy, for a chance to survive a world that had shown no mercy. Jack stepped fully into the doorway, closing the gap between them. The rain fell harder, soaking them both, but neither moved away. Lightning flashed, illuminating the two figures against the dark silhouette of the Harper house. And in that flash, Jack Harper made a choice that would bind him to a path he had long avoided. Jack Harper's boots squelched against the muddy porch as he stepped inside the Harper house, the old wood groaning under his weight. The rain hammered relentlessly against the roof, drumming a violent rhythm that echoed the storm raging inside him. Outside, the flashes of torchlight grew closer, casting elongated shadows through the rain-smeared windows. The gang was approaching, armed and ruthless, and the distant shouts of men carried over the wind like the first warning of a coming battle. For months, Jack had avoided such entanglements. Survival on the plains had taught him to move quickly, to stay silent, and to trust no one. But something about Emma's presence, the fire in her eyes and the desperation in her voice, stirred the instincts he had long buried. He felt the pull of duty, not just to her, but to the land, to the family legacy that had been entrusted to him. He closed the door behind him with a loud thud, the sound echoing in the sparsely furnished hall. The wood rattled in the frame, as if the house itself recognized the tension pressing against it. The rain, the wind, and the approaching menace outside seemed momentarily suspended as Jack's mind cleared, focusing solely on the threat before him. Emma's eyes met his. "They'll be here soon," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We can't hold them off if we don't act." Jack nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. The torches were nearer now, their flickering light illuminating the darkened shapes of men, moving with purpose. The gang wasn't here just to intimidate. They were here to seize everything by force. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the same that had saved his life countless times on the plains. "Okay, wife," he said quietly, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic weight. "Let's try to fight back." Emma blinked, taken aback by the words. Her lips parted slightly, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or shout. But there was no time for hesitation. Jack strode toward the sideboard and retrieved a pair of pistols, the familiar weight reassuring in his hands. He handed one to Emma, who took it with a determined nod, her fingers tightening around the grip. The house was small, but Jack's mind immediately mapped it as a defensive fortress. He could hear the wind rattling the windows, the creaking of the roof, the distant howl of a lone wolf somewhere in the hills. Each sound became a tool in his planning. He positioned themselves near the main door and windows, taking advantage of every shadow, every piece of furniture, every corner that could serve as cover. Emma moved beside him, more confident than she had been moments before. "I didn't think anyone would come," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I thought I was alone." Jack's jaw tightened. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "And if they want this land, they'll have to get through us first." Outside, the torches drew closer, and the faint sound of boots in the mud became more distinct. The gang's leader, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, shouted orders. Their plan was simple: overwhelm, intimidate, and take by force. But Jack had never been simple. He had survived ambushes, stampedes, and betrayal. And now, he had a reason to fight beyond mere survival. He turned to Emma. "Remember what I taught you in the plains," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Aim steady, breathe, and don't let fear dictate your hand. Fear gets you killed faster than any bullet." She nodded, gripping her pistol with renewed determination. Jack could see the transformation. The trembling hand was steady now, the wide eyes sharpened into focus. She was no longer just a frightened woman. She was a partner in the fight. The first of the gang's men reached the outer fence. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger, his mind calculating distance, timing, and potential paths of attack. Every movement mattered. Every second counted. He had faced overwhelming odds before, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't just his life. It was someone else's, and a legacy he couldn't let slip away. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the yard in a blinding flash. Shadows moved like dark phantoms across the rain-slicked grass. The gang's men hesitated, sensing resistance, their confidence wavering for just a moment. Jack seized the opportunity, signaling to Emma to take the left window while he covered the right. The first shots rang out, the crack of gunfire mixing with the storm's fury. Jack's aim was precise, his movements fluid, born of years on the plains. Emma fired beside him, surprisingly accurate despite the fear that still lingered. The gang's men fell back, stunned by the unexpected defense. "Keep moving," Jack instructed, ducking behind the sturdy frame of the windowsill. "Don't stay still. They'll anticipate a static target." Emma nodded, her face set, the storm reflecting in her determined eyes. Together, they became a coordinated force, covering each other, anticipating each move. Jack's years of experience guided them both, his leadership blending seamlessly with her courage. Outside, the torches bobbed closer, the gang regrouping for another attempt. But Jack had the advantage of preparation, of intimate knowledge of the land and the house's layout. He had survived alone for years, and now he was not alone. The battle lines were drawn, not just in the yard outside, but in the hearts of the two who stood within the old Harper house. Jack Harper had stepped forward, crossing the threshold not only of the house but of his own isolation, embracing the risk that came with connection, responsibility, and the chance to protect something greater than himself. As the storm continued to rage, the flickering light from the approaching gang illuminated Jack's steely determination and Emma's newfound resolve. And in that moment, the Harper house became more than a structure of wood and nails. It became a bastion of defiance, a place where two unlikely allies prepared to face overwhelming odds together. The night was far from over, but Jack Harper had made his choice. And as the first volleys of gunfire echoed into the storm, one truth remained clear: running was no longer an option. The storm outside had not lessened. Rain poured like sheets, turning the earth around the Harper house into a swampy mire. Jack Harper and Emma pressed themselves against the damp wood, their pistols ready, hearts pounding in unison. The gang had regrouped after their first failed assault, their shouts carrying over the storm, emboldened now by a renewed plan. But Jack had learned long ago that predictable men could be outsmarted, and ruthless ones often underestimated desperation. "They're not here for the house," Jack whispered, his eyes scanning the windows, reading every flicker torchlight. "They're after something else, something buried on the land." Emma's brow furrowed. "Gold?" she asked. Her voice carried a mix of fear and disbelief. "Father's journal, he mentioned a hidden stash, but it was just stories, wasn't it?" Jack shook his head. "Not stories. I've seen markings, hidden caches near the cliffs. The banker knows, or at least suspects. That's why they're desperate. If they get the gold, the house, and the land, we won't have a single ally in town. The sheriff's loyalty is already compromised. They've bribed him. Every road out of here is blocked, every escape burned, every neighbor intimidated. We're alone. Emma swallowed hard. The reality hit her, like a physical blow. Alone against a dozen armed men, facing not just their greed, but a calculated, ruthless plan. Then what do we do? She asked, gripping her pistol tighter. Her knuckles whitened, but the fear had been replaced by something else. Determination. Jack crouched beside her. We defend, he said simply. We use the house, the terrain, and the storm. We turn their overconfidence into their weakness. They think they can overwhelm us because we're two. We'll show them how deadly two can be when fighting for everything. Outside, the gang made their move. Torches bobbed violently across the wet fields, illuminating armed men advancing to the mud and waterlogged grass. Jack and Emma moved silently through the house, positioning themselves behind the thick walls, inside the narrow corridors, using every window as a potential point of cover. The first volley of bullets shattered the glass in the front windows. Splinters flew. Rain splashed in from the storm, and the gang's shouts echoed to the structure. Jack returned fire, each shot precise, aimed to disable without wasting bullets. Emma followed his lead, each movement becoming instinctive under his guidance. A fire ignited in the barn across the yard. Smoke and flames began to claw at the night sky, sending thick black clouds across the stormy horizon. The gang's tactics were clear. They wanted to drive them out, destroy supplies, and force surrender. Jack cursed under his breath. Losing the barn meant losing a significant defensive advantage, plus the storage of provisions they could have used in a prolonged siege. They've cut off the roads, Emma said, her voice tense as she peered through a window. Any chance of help from town is gone. Jack's jaw tightened. He surveyed the scene, the burning barn, the advancing thugs, the treacherous mud and rain. Each factor played into his mind's calculations. He had survived ambushes, betrayals, and stampedes, but this was different. This wasn't just survival. This was defense of legacy, of life, and now, of someone he had begun to care for. They'll try to flank us, Jack said, moving Emma toward the back windows overlooking a narrow, rocky pass. We can funnel them into the open. Rain and mud slow them down. We use that to our advantage. The gang was relentless. Men charged toward the house in waves, firing, shouting, trying to intimidate. But Jack and Emma were a fluid force, moving strategically, covering each other, creating traps, making the two of them seem like a larger presence in reality. Every shot they fired disrupted the gang's coordination. Every return fire from the thugs met with counteraction that showed Jack's experience and Emma's growing confidence. The banker's influence loomed like a shadow over Red Ridge. Jack knew that this fight wasn't only against men with guns. It was against a system, a corruption that reached beyond the fields and hills. If they lost, the banker would consolidate his control, and the gold hidden on the land would vanish into his coffers, leaving no trace. The night grew darker, the storm intensifying. Rain sluiced across the roof, water pooling in low spots. The fire in the barn crackled, sending sparks flying into the storm, the glow illuminating the advancing gang for brief moments. Jack noted every movement, every hesitation. Some of the men were clearly new to violence, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance. Others were seasoned, careful, and deadly. Jack realized that survival depended on more than firearms. It required improvisation, cunning, and the ability to anticipate the enemy's next move. He barricaded doors, moved furniture to create narrow choke points, and even rigged simple traps, nothing lethal, but enough to slow a determined advance. He whispered instructions to Emma, guiding her movements, keeping her calm, and ensuring their combined effectiveness. Hours seemed to stretch like days. Rain, fire, and gunfire merged into a relentless symphony of chaos. Yet Jack felt a strange clarity amidst the storm. This was the moment he had been unknowingly preparing for during his months of solitary wandering. Every cattle stampede he had controlled, every ambush he had avoided, every lesson from survival alone, now coalesced into a strategy that might just keep them alive. Emma adapted quickly. Her initial fear transformed into sharp awareness, each breath calculated, each shot deliberate. The spark of hope she carried was reinforced by Jack's presence. Together, they became a single unit, a defensive force more formidable than the gang anticipated. Lightning illuminated a figure at the edge of the smoke-filled yard. Jack's eyes narrowed. Could it be help? Or another threat? The storm blurred the line between friend and enemy, and trust was a currency neither could afford lightly. But one thing was certain. They were not giving up. The land, the house, and the hidden gold were worth every risk. And Jack Harper, the man who had wandered alone for months to avoid pain, now understood the cost of inaction. The threat had grown, yes, but so had their resolve. And as another volley of bullets tore through the rain, Jack and Emma braced themselves. They were ready to fight, not just for survival, but for everything they held dear. The night had been a siege, one long, punishing test of endurance, will, and skill. Jack Harper's arms ached from holding his revolver at the ready for hours. His ears still rang from the thunder of gunfire, the shouts of men, the roaring storm outside. Emma's face was smudged with soot and rainwater. Her hair tangled and plastered to her cheeks, but her eyes, those steady, defiant eyes, still burned with the same fire that had carried them through the long night. The gang had thrown everything they had at the Harper house. Bullets had chipped the old wood. Flames had scorched the barn to the ground. Every attempt to break inside had been met with resistance. Jack's precise aim, Emma's well-timed shots, and a shifting defense that made two people seem like a small army. But despite their efforts, Jack knew they couldn't hold forever. Ammunition was running low. The walls could only take so much abuse before a determined force broke through. And then, as if summoned by some long-forgotten dead in the universe, the sound of pounding hooves cut through the chaos. At first, Jack thought it might be more of the banker's men, a fresh wave to finish the job. But as the figures emerged from the smoke and rain, he recognized the lead rider instantly, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, with a rifle slung across his back, rode hard toward the yard. Lightning illuminated his face, worn, sun-leathered, and marked by a half-healed scar above the jaw. Wes Calder, a wandering cowboy like Jack, but with his own complicated ledger of debts and favors. Years ago, in a nameless canyon, Jack had pulled Wes from the path of an ambush. He hadn't expected repayment. Out here, debts were often forgotten or settled with a bullet. But tonight, Wes had come to collect in the only way that mattered. "Thought you might need an extra hand," Wes called, swinging down from his horse before it had even stopped moving. Two other riders followed, quiet, competent-looking men, who clearly owed Wes the same kind of debt Wes owed Jack. Without a word, they positioned themselves along the fence line, rifles ready, their eyes scanning for targets through the storm. The gang hesitated. Their confidence wavered for the first time all night. What had seemed like a simple job, overpowering two defenders, had now become something far riskier. Jack didn't waste time. "Emma, reload," he ordered, his voice sharp and clear over the storm. He moved to the window, signaling to Wes where the bulk of the attackers were positioned. A flurry of coordinated shots followed, clean, precise, and devastating. The gang staggered, their formation breaking apart under the sudden three-pronged assault. And then another figure appeared, this one on foot, moving quickly through the mud. Jack almost didn't recognize her at first. A young woman, dressed in a soaked riding coat, her hair tied back in a hasty knot. Her presence in the yard was almost surreal in the chaos. But when she slipped behind the cover of an overturned wagon and began firing with startling accuracy, Jack knew exactly who she was. Clara Marston, the sheriff's daughter. Jack's stomach tightened. If Clara was here, it meant she was acting against her father's direct orders. Orders likely bought and paid for by the banker. Her loyalty wasn't to the law of the town, but to the idea of law itself, of justice, fairness, and doing what was right, even when it meant crossing dangerous lines. "Sheriff's not going to like this," Jack muttered under his breath as Clara sent another attacker scrambling for cover. "He doesn't have to know," she shot back, reloading without missing a beat. "And if he does, he can arrest me after we win." With Wes and his men anchoring the outer defenses and Clara covering the blind spots, the tide of the battle shifted. The gang's lines dissolved entirely. Some men retreating into the rain, others throwing down their weapons in surrender. In the chaos, the leader of the gang, the scarred man, made a desperate rush toward the house. Jack met him halfway across the yard, mud flying beneath their boots. The fight was short, brutal, and final. Jack didn't kill him. He didn't have to. A well-placed punch dropped the man to the mud, and the remaining gang members scattered, their loyalty to the banker no match for the instinct to survive. When the gunfire finally ceased, the only sounds were the heavy patter of rain and the crackle of the dying barn fire. Jack stood in the mud, breathing hard, his revolver hanging loosely in his hand. Emma emerged from the doorway, her pistol still ready, though her hands shook from exhaustion rather than fear. It was Clara who stepped forward to deal the final blow, not with a bullet, but with evidence. From inside her coat, she produced a small leather satchel, soaked from the rain but intact. She tossed it onto the porch at Emma's feet. When Emma opened it, her eyes widened. Inside was a stack of documents, ledgers, contracts, and letters that tied the banker directly to the gang, to illegal claims on the land, and most damningly, to the gold buried on the property. "Got these from my father's office," Clara said matter-of-factly. The sheriff didn't know what he was sitting on. Or maybe he didn't want to know. Either way, it's enough to hang the banker in the court of public opinion, if not in the courtroom. The next morning, the storm had passed, and Red Ridge was buzzing with news. The townsfolk, drawn by the rumors of gold and corruption, gathered in the square to hear Clara read the evidence aloud. The banker, cornered and stripped of his power, had no choice but to face the scrutiny of those he had manipulated for years. Jack and Emma stood together at the edge of the crowd, silent observers. Wes and his men lingered nearby, their part in the story already fading into the background, as they preferred. Clara, radiant with determination, refused to let the banker spin his lies. Every word she read was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. By the time the sun reached its peak, the banker's influence had crumbled. The gold, once the source of greed and bloodshed, was now evidence, proof of his machinations. The sheriff, shamed by his daughter's courage, was left to choose between his badge and his dignity. Jack knew the fight wasn't over. The West had a way of breeding new threats as soon as old ones were gone. But for now, the Harper land was safe. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it might stay that way, at least for a little while. The week after the battle felt like a different lifetime. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and glistening under the late summer sun. The Harper property, though scarred, still stood, its fences in need of repair, its barn nothing but a smoldered frame, but the house itself solid, unbroken. Jack Harper stood at the fence line with a hammer in one hand and a fresh cedar post balanced on his shoulder. Sweat rolled down his neck as he drove the post into the earth, the rhythmic sound of metal onward carrying across the quiet fields. Beside him, Emma knelt in the grass, twisting wire into place, her sleeves rolled up, a streak of dirt on her cheek. "You missed a spot," Jack said without looking at her, his voice dry. Emma glanced up, narrowing her eyes. "You've missed about 20, she shot back. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Jack's mouth. It wasn't much, but it was real, unforced and free of the weight he'd carried for so long. Emma caught it, and though she didn't comment, her own lips curved into something lighter, something that felt almost like the first breath after a long dive. The land smelled different now, rich with damp earth, faintly smoky from the burnt barn, but somehow more alive. Cattle grazed in the far pasture, their calm movements a stark contrast to the chaos of the week before. A pair of hawks circled lazily overhead, their shadows sweeping across the grass. Life was returning, slow but steady. The townsfolk had been coming by in ones and twos since word of the banker's downfall spread. Some brought food, others tools, and a few just offered their hands for the rebuilding. The same people who had looked away when the banker tightened his grip on Red Ridge now met Jack and Emma's eyes with something like respect, and maybe a touch of guilt. Wes had left 2 days after the fight, his debt repaid without fanfare. He didn't like staying in one place for too long. Jack understood that better than most. Clara visited once more before riding back to town, her father silent and brooding in the background, his badge still pinned to his vest, but his authority a little dimmer than before. For Jack, the days fell into a quiet rhythm. Wake with the dawn, repair what could be repaired, tend to the land, share simple meals with Emma, and fall asleep to the hum of crickets instead of the roar of storms or the crack of gunfire. It was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. One evening, as the sun slid low over the hills, painting the sky in gold and rose, Jack leaned on the fence rail and looked out over the property. The shadows stretched long, the light soft and forgiving. Emma joined him, her hands resting lightly on the wood. "Looks different without torches and gunfire," she said, her voice quiet. Jack nodded. "Better this way." For a while, they just stood there, watching the cattle shift in the pasture. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had survived together. Emma broke it first. "You're staying, then?" Jack didn't answer right away. He had spent so long running from places, from people, from the weight of connection, but the road held no pull for him now. Here, the dangers were clear, the land honest in its demands. And here, someone was willing to share the burden. "I think I am," he said finally. Emma's smile was small but certain. "Good. I'd hate to fix all this just for you to ride off again." They worked a little longer as the light faded, the sound of the hammer, and the scrape of wire blending with the evening breeze. When the sun dipped completely behind the ridge, the sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars began to appear. Jack straightened and stretched, feeling the ache in his shoulders. Emma gathered the tools, her movements easy, unhurried. "We'll need to rebuild the barn before winter," she said. "But the house is solid. We'll be fine." Jack looked toward the house, its walls weathered but strong, its windows glinting faintly in the starlight. "Yeah," he said. "We will." They walked back together, the grass cool beneath their boots, fireflies winking in the dark. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the kitchen stove. Emma lit a lamp, its soft glow pooling across the table where a loaf of bread and a pot of stew waited. Jack paused at the doorway, watching her move around the room, and felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. Not the guarded stillness of a man waiting for trouble, but the kind of peace that comes when you stop looking over your shoulder. Outside, the crickets sang. Inside, the walls held steady against the night. And for the first time in years, Jack Harper didn't feel like a man passing through. The sun would rise tomorrow over Red Ridge, as it always had. There would be fences to mend, a barn to raise, and endless work that would keep their hands busy and their minds steady. But for now, they sat down to share a meal, the silence between them warm and familiar. And when Jack looked across the table and saw Emma laughing softly at something he hadn't even realized he'd said, he thought, perhaps, this was worth more than all the miles he'd ever ridden. A quiet, real life had begun.